This is really a part of a continuing series on laws of Shemitah. We had one shir about the Prus Bowl sometime before Rosh Hashanah, and I really want to get into the laws of Shemitah. This is, again, another introductory discussion. And the title of the shir tonight is Shemitah Bizman Hazeh, D-Oraysah or D-Rabanan. Are the laws of Shemitah, does the requirement that the Torah places upon us to make sure that our lands remain fallow, unplanted, and that we have to treat the produce with a certain sanctity, which we'll learn about many of the details later, is that a law that applies today, D-Oraysah, or is only rabbinic? Now, we saw a beginning of this discussion when we learned about the laws of Prus Bowl, and the Gemara itself was disturbed by how Hillel could enact a law that creates a legal loophole around the biblical law. If the Torah says that all debts are wiped away in the Shemitah year, how could Hillel circumvent that and create a mechanism whereby debts are not canceled? The Torah says that debts are canceled. How can Hillel get around that? If you notice, the Gemara asked this question. This is just a review from what we did before Rosh Hashanah. It's in source number 1. It's the Gemara in Gittin Daf Lamed Vav, and it's the very bottom of Amud Aleph. So we don't have to go through the whole Gemara, but it's starting with the fourth line in front of you, where the Gemara says, Umi kamidi. How could there be such a situation, de D-Oraysah mishameta shvius, that biblically the Torah says that debts are wiped away, v'hiskin Hillel de lo mishamta, and yet Hillel could come along and contravene that law and say that no, D-Rabanan, the debts are still valid. How does that work? You never find that a rabbi can come and cancel a biblical law. Amar Abaye. So Abaye answers, Bashvius bizman hazeh. We're talking about Shemitah today, in today's world, v'Rebbi, and Hillel follows the Shita of Rabbi. D'Tanya. Rabbi Omer, as the Brisa taught, Rabbi says, V'zeh devar ha-Shemitah shamot. This shall be the law of Shemitah, you shall cancel. And the fact that the word Shemitah and Shamot appear back to back teaches us that there are two Shemitahs that are being discussed. B'shtei Shemitos hakosov medaber, echa Shemitas karka, ve'echa Shemitas kesafim. One is talking about the cancellation of land, of real estate, and the other one is talking about the cancellation of monetary debts. Now, what do we mean by the cancellation of land? We're talking about the reversion of real estate at the time of the Yovel, during the Jubilee year. So what we learn from here is, Bisman she'ata meshamet karka ata meshamet kesafim. When you cancel real estate and all sales go back to the original owner, so then you also cancel debts. Bisman she'ata meshamet karka i'ata meshamet kesafim. But when there's no Yovel law, and the Gemara says that Yovel does not apply, and we'll get to that in just a second. When Yovel does not apply, so then the law of cancellation of debts every Shemitah does not apply either. However, v'takinu Rabbanan detishamed zecher lashvius. So there's only a rabbinic law that the rabbis instituted to cancel, to say that there is a cancellation despite the fact that biblically there is no cancellation. And then, but Hillel saw that there was more detriment to benefit by abiding by that rabbinic law of remembering the cancellation of debts that takes place at Shemitah, because he saw that as a result people were not fulfilling the biblical commandment to lend money. And therefore he said, you know what, we'll find a loophole around the biblical law of Shemitah's Ksafim. And so this is very, very...
Sorry, wouldn't that problem exist before we had...
No, before, when the Shemitah was extant, D-Oraysah, and Shemitah's Ksafim was a biblical mechanism, people were of a higher moral fiber. And so therefore, they abided by the law. And they lent people money, and they abided by the rule that debts are canceled at the end of Shemitah. But unfortunately, by the time we get to Hillel towards the end of the Second Temple era, people are not as refined and are not as God-fearing as they once were. And so, on the one hand, the rabbis want to remind people what it is to fulfill the laws of Shemitah, but Hillel sees a detriment because now people are not lending anyone money. Okay, so that's really the way the Gemara comes up with this discussion. Now, how do we know that Yovel does not apply anymore? So this is a Gemara that we had seen in Erichin on Daf Lamed Beis, and it's source number 3, that the Gemara tells us that Mishagalu Shevet Ruvain v'Shevet Gad v'Chatzi Shevet HaMenashe Batlu Yovlos. That once there was no longer a complete conglomerate of all 12 tribes of Israel in Eretz Yisrael, once even a portion of the tribes were exiled, the laws of Yovel no longer applied biblically. Shenemar ukrasem diror ba'aretz l'chol yosheveha. As it says, you shall declare freedom throughout the land for all of its inhabitants. So it has to be bisman shekol yoshveh aleha, the lo bisman shegalu mikzasan. Only when all of Bnei Yisrael are living in Eretz Yisrael, all 12 tribes are present, the laws of Yovel apply. But once even a portion of the 12 tribes are missing, then the laws of Yovel do not apply. Now this Gemara in itself is a bit controversial as to whether or not it's agreed to by all and what the scope of it, what the words mean that all 12 tribes have to be living there. But the Gemara takes it at its face value. The Gemara in Gittin, the fact that we no longer have the 12 tribes living and settled in their apportioned territories in Eretz Yisrael means that Shemitah no longer applies. Now, there's a very interesting Rashi on that Gemara in Gittin in source number 2. He says, Bashvius bisman hazeh. He says, V'Hillel kerebi svirole. Hillel therefore holds like Rebbe. De Omar Shvius lahashmatas milva bisman hazeh D-Rabanan. And you have to be medayik ashtikul in the language of Rashi. He says Shemitah, vis-a-vis the laws of cancellation of debts, today only applies rabbinically. Now, what does Rashi mean by those words? Does he mean to say that the laws of Shemitah are completely out the window today, D-Oraysah? Or does he mean to say that only one aspect of Hilchos Shemitah is out the window today, D-Oraysah, and it only applies D-Rabanan? That extra verbiage that Rashi adds, where he says, Shvius lahashmatas milva bisman hazeh D-Rabanan, implies that it's only vis-a-vis the laws of cancellation of debts that we say that Shemitah is only rabbinic. But keep that in mind. And even though Hillel was during the temple period, so it seems that you have all of the criteria to have the laws of Shemitah because you have the Beis HaMikdash. Nevertheless, Svirale la'abaya dibabaya sheni hoil v'lohaya yovel noheg lo nahagu shmitin D-Oraysah. But Hillel is of the opinion, like Abaya says in Erichin, that since Yovel is no longer extant in the Second Temple, therefore Shemitah is no longer extant. U'de'amrinan be'erichin monu yovlos l'kadei shmitin D-Rabanan ka'amar. So therefore, when the Gemara in Erichin says that the Yovel year was counted, in other words, there's this whole controversy. Today, we count a series of 7 years in order to arrive at Shemitah. Now, after every 7 years of 7 cycles of 7 years, do we add an additional year of Yovel? No, we don't do that. We don't do that anymore today. But during Bayit Sheni, they did. So therefore, doesn't that imply that Yovel applied during Bayit Sheni? No. It only was inserted as a marker because the counting of Yovel still applied when there was a Beis HaMikdash, but the laws of Yovel did not apply. It's a strange kind of thing. In other words, they counted the 50th year during Bayit Sheni, but the laws of Yovel did not apply based on this biblical precept that you don't have all of the Shvatim present during the Second Temple period. Umatzasi b'talmidei Rabbeinu Yitzchak HaLevi, I found the following teaching among the students of Rabbeinu Yitzchak HaLevi. And he writes, Shekosav b'maseches Gittin b'Yerushalmi, minayin she'en hashmita noheges ela bizman sheyovel noheg. How do you know that Shemitah only is extant biblically when we have Yovel? Shenemar v'zeh devar hashemita shamot, echa shmitas Yovel ve'echa shmitas Shavias. So he's really just basically quoting the Gemara in Erchin that says that you have to link Yovel to Shemitah. And when there's no Yovel, there's no Shemitah D-Oraysah. Aval, and then he continues from the students of Rabbeinu Yitzchak, and he says, Aval b'torat kohanim ra'isi, d'shvias noheg bisman, she'ein Yovel noheg. That I noticed that there's another opinion that says that Shemitah is extant even in the absence of Yovel, and va'omer ani shehu machlokes. And I therefore say that it's a machlokes. Now, how can Rashi say that in light of the fact that our Gemara says that the Prus Bowl is all predicated upon the fact that there's no Shemitah? One of two possibilities. Either the opinion that says that Shemitah is extant bisman hazeh does not allow for Prus Bowl, and Hillel therefore only paskins according to Rabbi, but there's another opinion among the Rishonim that hold like the Chachamim, and therefore you cannot utilize a Prus Bowl bisman hazeh. That would be one option. What the other option is, I'm not really sure. The other option could be that maybe everyone agrees to Rebbe that Shemitah's Ksafim does not work D-Oraysah today, but there still is the law of Shemitah agriculturally that still applies D-Oraysah. And that we're going to see shortly. Now, I wanted us to see the Gemaras as our background information.
If that was true, you wouldn't need a Prus Bowl.
Yes, you would, because rabbinically there is. That's the whole point. Rabbis came along and said, even though there's no cancellation of debts biblically, we want to remind people what was done when there was biblical cancellations of debts. So we will officially cancel all debts D-Rabanan. And Hillel comes along and he says, no, to counteract the rabbinic law, write a Prus Bowl. It's like the Eruv, like we mentioned a few weeks ago. The Eruv is a mechanism that eliminates the rabbinic prohibition of carrying on Shabbos, but does not obviate a biblical prohibition of carrying on Shabbos. Okay? That's the same mechanism of Prus Bowl. The mystery is going to be, and I want to say this at the outset, the mystery is going to be the Aryeh Shebachabura, the Ari Shebachabura, the lion of the master teacher, the Rambam, who is really referenced by most poskim to determine the laws of Shemitah today, is extremely vague in this area of whether Shemitah agriculturally applies bisman hazeh D-Oraysah or D-Rabanan. And it's very, very bizarre because he's extremely explicit in all of the laws of Shemitah, except in this one area, to explain to us whether Shemitah agriculturally applies bisman hazeh D-Oraysah D-Rabanan. He does acknowledge, and we'll see that even explicitly, he does say that Shemitah's Ksafim bisman hazeh only applies D-Rabanan, but he never says explicitly one way or the other. Now, why the Rambam was vague in this area? The Rambam doesn't do anything indiscriminately. Even when he's vague, he's intentionally vague. And it would seem to me that he did this because he understood the tremendous burden upon Bnei Eretz Yisrael to have to abide by all of the stringencies of Shemitah in the event that Shemitah is D-Oraysah. Now, we do need to also understand that there are very practical ramifications if Shemitah is D-Oraysah or D-Rabanan bisman hazeh. One of the things that we rely upon, or that generations, and even up to the 20th century, have relied upon, is allowing land that belongs to non-Jews in Eretz Yisrael to be cultivated, to be planted, and even to allow Jews to work those lands. That only works if Shemitah is D-Rabanan. If Shemitah is D-Oraysah, then it doesn't matter that it belongs to a Gentile. It's still going to be usher to work the soil. And we'll see that in the Rambam himself. Okay, let's take a look. We're going to see a few sources in the Rambam. Let's first look at the Rambam in the first chapter in Halacha Yud Aleph in Hilchos Shemitah v'Yovel. The Rambam here is quoting a Gemara which says, Misharabu ha'anasim, that the Jewish people were under persecution in the Middle East. And therefore, v'hitilu malkei akum al Yisrael la'asos machanos l'chayeloseim. And the various armies that would travel through the land of Israel would place a burden upon the Jews living in Eretz Yisrael to make camp and to feed their soldiers. Eretz Yisrael is a major thoroughfare if you want to cross from the African continent into anywhere in Asia, or Europe, you would pass through Eretz Yisrael. So it was a major traveling point. I don't know what the word is I'm not thinking of. It was a major thoroughfare across, what's the word I'm looking for? A crossroads, or a conduit, right? And so it was very common for the Jews to be sort of get short shrift of this, because they were forced now to provide for all of the armies that were passing through. And therefore, hitiru lizroa b'shvius dvarim shetzrichim lehem avdei hamelech bilvad. And therefore, the Chachamim gave a heter that even during Shemitah, it is permitted to plant during the Shemitah year in Eretz Yisrael in order to grow produce that was needed to feed the soldiers. Azoi zak the Rambam. Now, the question is, what's the heter? If the Torah says, don't plant during Shemitah, what's the heter to do this? I mean, can I be Machalal Shabbos in order to feed the soldiers? I would think not. If I can't be Machalal Shabbos to feed soldiers, what's the heter to plant in order to feed the soldiers?
Hang on, why don't you say there's some kind of nefashos involved here?
All right, one second. We have to see. We have to see exactly what the issue. Just because they're soldiers doesn't automatically mean there's sakanas nefashos. It could be that's true. That's the way some meforshim learn, but we'll see. V'chein mi shekefa'o anas la'asos b'shvius b'chinam k'mo avodas hamelech b'chayotzi bahen harei ze oseh. And in all other cases, not just in cases of traveling armies, but in any situation where you're under pressure from someone who's more powerful than you, who is coercing you to provide for him during the Shemitah without payment, you have a heter to plant for that person in order to be able to produce commodities that will be able to mollify your oppressor. Okay, so the Rambam doesn't just limit it to traveling armies. He says any situation where you're under the gun. Doesn't literally mean under the gun, which would mean sakanas nefashos, but anytime you're under pressure. Comes along the Ravid and he says, Amar Avram, Anu kibalnu ha'anasim arnona, shenotel hamelech chomesh miperos ha'aretz. He says, our understanding of that Gemara, when it talks about arnona, when it talks about an obligatory tax, is where the king says, okay, all Jews have to surrender 1/5, 20% of their produce in any given year, have to surrender those commodities to the government. It's a very, very stiff tax. It's almost like HST, right? It's HST up to 13%, and this is 20%. Okay. So, umi she'eno ovda, gozlan osa mimenu. And if a person doesn't produce the expected yield, they just come and confiscate his property. And v'hamakomo shelo hechaziku b'hen olei bavel v'lo haisa shevias noheges b'hen ela midivreihem b'hem hitiru lavod mipnei ha'ones avalo b'masha hechaziku. But the Ravid says, but I don't agree with the Rambam. The Rambam does not qualify where in Eretz Yisrael you're permitted to plant. Once you're under this coercion, you can plant anywhere in Eretz Yisrael because you got to come up with the provisions for the strong arms. But the Ravid says, based on our understanding of what this compulsion is that it's a tax. It's not that someone's holding a gun to your head; it's that they're going to take away your property. So therefore, the Ravid says we don't give you a heter to willy-nilly just plant during Shemitah because otherwise you're going to lose your farm. That's not enough of a basis for giving you a heter to violate the Torah law. We will therefore only give you a heter to plant in areas which were not annexed to become part of Eretz Yisrael when the Jews came back to build the second temple. Because as we know, Eretz Yisrael was much larger during Bayis Rishon than it was during Bayis Sheni. We just had that in the Daf Yomi. Right? And therefore, only in those areas which were not re-sanctified as Eretz Yisrael proper, like let's say the Transjordan, certain northern parts of the Golan, perhaps, those are areas where we would give you, or the Gaza, those are areas we would give you a heter to plant, and because there's only Shemitah D-Rabanan in those places, not Shemitah D-Oraysah. But where there's Shemitah D-Oraysah, there is no such heter to plant in order to save your assets. The question, of course, is again, What's shot in the Rambam? We understand the Ravid, who says that there's no heter if there's only financial pressure upon you to deliver the goods. You have no heter to violate Shemitah D-Oraysah. Is the Rambam giving you a heter to violate Shemitah D-Oraysah because of sakanas nefashos, as Reb Shmuel has suggested? Or does the Rambam also hold that Shemitah Bizman Hazeh is D-Rabanan? And that's why he's not really disagreeing with the Ravid at all, but he's saying the same thing. But his point is that whereas the Ravid holds that Shemitah Bizman Hazeh is D-Oraysah in Eretz Yisrael proper,
right,
the Rambam holds that Shemitah Bizman Hazeh is D-Rabanan everywhere, even in Eretz Yisrael proper. And that's why he doesn't qualify his words. He says anytime you're under pressure, even financial pressure, we give you permission to go ahead and violate the rabbinic law of Shemitah. That's the suffix in the Rambam. And there's two ways of reading the Rambam, and it's deliberately ambiguous. Okay, let's go weiter. Take a look at the Kesef Mishnah. The problem with the Kesef Mishnah, as we will see, who wrote the Kesef Mishnah, everybody? Rabbi Yosef Karo, the Beis Yosef. As you will see, the Kesef Mishnah contradicts himself. In some places he says that Shemitah Bizman Hazeh is D-Oraysah, and in some places he says Shemitah Bizman Hazeh is D-Rabanan. We'll see this. So says the Kesef Mishnah in source number 5, to comment on the Rambam Shita, he says, Beperek zeh borer, mishe rabu ha'anasim umayninu arnuna, k'demachriz Rabbi Yanai puk v'zaru b'shvius mishum arnona. So he says, what is the word anasim, thugs or strong arms? It means people who are forcibly collecting taxes. And they said, Chazru lomar osvei shvius kisherim, that those who harvest and work the soil during shvius are kosher Jews because of the pressure they're under. Umefaresh Rabbeinu shehitilu malchei rome lasos machanos l'chayelosehem. And our teacher, the Rambam, holds that they were forced by armies to set up camp for their soldiers. V'Rashi pirish arnona mas shegova min ha'tevuos. Kach lekach min hasada l'shana. Puk uzara b'shvius shvius b'zman hazeh D-Rabanan debatlo kedusha sa'aretz. And the Kesef Mishnah also adds that the way that the Rambam understands the Gemara is that it's permitted to go and plant during the Shemitah year. Why? Because Shemitah Bizman Hazeh is the Rabbanan. Let's take a look at another Rambam. In Halacha Beis in Perek Tes, the Rambam writes, based on the Gemara in Gittin that we saw just a few moments ago. By the way, if anyone's lost yet, just holler, and we'll go over. We'll just chazer, because there's many different moving parts here. Okay, so far we've talked about Shmitas Ksafim, and we've seen that it's a machlokas between Rabbi and the Chachamim whether Shmitas Ksafim Bizman Hazeh is D-Oraysah D-Rabanan, and now we've moved over to planting during Shemitah because of duress or coercion from the government. Now let's take a look at another halacha from the Rambam, which goes back to the idea of Shmitas Ksafim. He says, Ein Shmitas Ksafim noheges min haTorah, ela bizman shahayovel noheg, sheyeh sham Shmitas Karka. So the Rambam is very clear. He paskins like Rabbi, and he talks about the pruzbol like Hillel, and he says that Shemitah, for Shmitas Ksafim, he writes, Ein Shmitas Ksafim noheges min haTorah, that the cancellation of debts is only a biblical precept when there's Yovel. And he says, and uvizman, I'm just skipping a couple lines, is uvizman she'en sham shmitas karka, ena tamash mikasafim bashvius afilu ba'aretz. And therefore, when there's no law of shmitas karka, of the land going back during Yovel, then the law of cancellation of debts does not apply even in Eretz Yisrael, let alone outside of Eretz Yisrael. So comes along here the Kesef Mishnah in source number 7 to explain the Rambam. Ein Shmitas Ksafim noheges min haTorah, ad kedei shelo tishtakach beperek hashaleach gittin ucher Rabbi, and the Rambam is clearly going like Rabbi, like we saw in Maseches Gittin. Okay, everyone with me so far? He says, V'nira medivre Rabbeinu, shemefare shemasha amru sham bizman she'ata meshamet karka ata meshamet ksafim liyovel kari meshamet karka shaharei sados chazos liba olam chmoshe kasa b'sof perek yud. He says it's clear that the Rambam is linking the laws of Yovel to the laws of the cancellation of debts. Aval Shemitas Karka af bizman hazeh noheges min ha-Torah. But the agricultural laws of Shemitah even today apply min ha-Torah, biblically. He seems to be contradicting himself as to what he said in Perek Aleph. Okay? Seems to be. There might be a way of being miyashiv. I think there is. Let's go on to the next Rambam. We're going to see 3 Rambams tonight, okay? Let's go on to our next Rambam. This is in the 4th Perek of Hilchos Shemitah, Halacha Chafhei. And the Rambam writes, Ein shvius noheges ela be'eretz Yisrael bilvad, shenemar ki savou el haaretz v'gomer, v'noheges bein bifnei habayis, bein shelo bifnei habayis. The Rambam writes that the laws of Shemitah apply both with the presence of a temple and in the absence of a temple. And the Rambam is saying the biblical law of Shemitah applies because he's quoting a pasuk, Kisavo el haaretz. Right? He's talking about the biblical law of Shemitah is extant both during the temple times and even in the absence of a temple. Now, has there ever been a time in Jewish history when all 12 tribes have been collectively living in Eretz Yisrael after the destruction of the temple?
No.
They were dispersed.
In principle, not even before.
Even before the destruction of the temple.
Even before, well,
The Herod was 133 years before the destruction of the first Beis Hamikdash.
that's right, even during. But you could argue before Shlomo HaMelech built the Beis HaMikdash, you did have the Shnei Mesrei Shvatim living.
Yeah, you had it up until the Galus and Herod.
That's right, that's right.
Including Shalom.
Okay. But the Rambam seems to be saying that Shemitah agriculturally applies D-Oraysah even after the Churban. He seems to be saying that. Based on that, the Kesef Mishnah has a big problem with the Rambam, because we just saw in Perek Tes that the Rambam says that Shemitah's Ksafim only applies D-Rabanan. So, let's take a look. We're going to skip a big chunk of the Kesef Mishnah where he just quotes the Gemara in Gittin.
Maybe he's only referring to, hypothetically, if the 12 tribes were there with the temple, then it would apply.
You mean with or without the temple?
Right.
Could be. Maybe he's just saying that the criterion is not the presence of a temple, but rather another criterion. Okay, I accept that.
Are there 2 elements of the karka? One is on the land and one is on the people?
Yes, that's absolutely true. There's a prohibition on the people to work the soil, and there's a sanctity, there's an inherent sanctity in the land that the produce that does even grow by itself has to be treated with a certain sanctity. You're absolutely right. But I don't think that we're seeing that distinction here yet, because if we say that the laws of Shemitah apply, unless we are given that clear distinction as you've drawn it, we would have no reason to make it ourselves. Okay? So, I'm going to skip down. It's about 10 lines down. It's 5 lines from the bottom on page 2. He says, Umidivrei Rabbeinu po nirashu husover, da'af shelo bifnei habayis, noheges min ha-Torah. It seems clear from the Rambam here that the laws of Shemitah apply biblically even with the absence of a temple. Upasa ki ahi de Torah's kohanim, mishum demashma dehahi kachachamim depligi alei de Rabbi. And remember that Torah's kohanim that Rashi quoted from, that says that Shemitah applies biblically even today? He says it seems that that's how the Rambam paskins, because he's going like that medrash in the Sifra, in the Torah's kohanim, and because it's going like the Chachamim and not like Rebbe. V'halacha kerabim, because when there's a machlokas between Rebbe and the Chachamim, we generally paskin like the Chachamim. So zok the Kesef Mishnah aval kasha shaharei kasav v'perek tes hahide ketani Rebbe bisman sha'ata meshamit karka ata meshamit ksafim. The problem is that he holds like Rebbe as far as the Prusbol. That Shemitah's ksafim is only biblical today. So how can you tell me that Shemitah does apply biblically today in this parak, And yet, in Perek Tes, when you're talking about Shemitah's Ksafim, only say that Shemitah's D-Rabanan. Va'o de'ahi de pruzbol lesa ela liba de Rabbi. And furthermore, the whole mechanism of pruzbol will only work if you hold that Shemitah's D-Rabanan, like Rabbi. So how can the Rambam paskin like the Chachamim? This is the Kesef Mishnah's Kasha. The Kevin Shirabenu Paske elahi de pruzbol mashma de savrle karebi. Ve'ech nomar shekan pasak Chachamim. This is the question, yes? He's so sure himself. Here he paskins like the Chachamim, there by Shemitah's Ksafim he paskins like Rebbe. Lefichach nirali de la'olam kerebi svirale. And therefore it seems to me, says the Rambam, says the Kesef Mishnah, that the Rambam paskins like Rebbe. V'lo kasha, shehu zal mifaresh, because he'll explain. Ha de Omar Rebbe b'shtei Shmitos hakasav medaber echa Shmitas karkos. Lo ashmitas karkos b'shvias ka'amar dehahi la'olam nahaga af shelo b'fnei habayis. When the Gemara says that cancellation of debts applies when there's cancellation of land, it's not referring to the cancellation of working the land in Shemitah, but rather ella liyovel kari shmitas karkos shaharei hasados chosus leba'olam echumover b'devar v'reish perek tes. It means that when the laws of Yovel are extant, then the laws of cancellation of debts are extant. And when the laws of Yovel are not extant, then the laws of Shmitas Kisafim do not apply biblically. V'chein pirish Rabbeinu tam. Avol kasher shekasav Rabbeinu beferish bisman she'ena Yovel noig, eno noig echas mikol elu chutz mishvias baretz ve'ashmatas Kisafim b'chol makom midivreihem. Arei shekasav b'shvias bisman she'en Yovel noig, ena ela midivreihem. Va'afilu shvias de karkos. But the problem is that the Rambam also wrote that the laws of Shemitah don't apply when Yovel doesn't apply, except rabbinically. It only applies rabbinically. So how can he say over here that it applies biblically? V'yesh lomar demidivreim deka'amar lo koi elo lahashmatas kisafim desamachle. The ilu Shmitas karkos D-Oraysah nami nohaga b'chol zman. So the Kesef Mishnah spells it out explicitly. He says that according to the Rambam, the agricultural laws of Shemitah apply D-Oraysah. It's only the financial laws of cancellation of debts which are downgraded to rabbinic and are no longer D-Oraysah since Yovel is not Noheg. The ihava amrinan shama shekasa rabbeinu kandenogos afshalo b'fnei bais D-Rabanan havanicha avol pasht the milsa the D-Oraysah kamar. It would be much easier, says the Kesef Mishnah, to not give this kvetch, to say that the Rambam divides the laws of Shemitah's Ksafim from the laws of agricultural Shemitah, and we would have to say that the Rambam over here is only telling us that Shemitah agriculturally is extant D-Rabanan, but the language of the Rambam itself does not lend itself to that. That's what he's saying. Yes, Reb Shmuel.
I have a problem with the Rambam, which is not quoted here. Shemitah Yovel Perek Yud Halacha Tes. He says, first of all, talks about Halacha Tes Mishagala Shevet Reuven Shevet Gad Chazak Shevet Menashe Batlu Hayayvos.
Right.
Because it's not, it says the Kol Yishval La, it's not Kol Yishval, finished. So he says, B'zman Shenoyel Noig, he goes through that, and he says, B'zman She'ein Yovel Noig, Ein Noig Eved Evri, V'loi Bati Erei Chayma, V'loi Sedei Achuza, V'loi Sedei Charamim, V'ein Mekalvim Ger Taisha, V'naiheges Shviyas Ba'aretz Midivreya.
Only for Shemitah's Ksafim. No! That's what the Kesef Mishnah will tell you.
Okay.
The Kesef Mishnah will have to give that kvetch, that what the Rambam means. You have to take a look. I have to take a look at the Frankel Rambam also. Maybe there's something there also. But you'd have to take a look. Yeah. The Kesef Mishnah. Take a look at the Kesef Mishnah over there.
Right.
He's going to have to tell you that the Rambam is only talking about Shemitah's Ksafim over there. He's not talking about all of the laws of Shemitah.
Okay.
You'll let me know?
No, the Kesef Mishnah says that. Kesef Mishnah says that.
Okay, so at least he's consistent.
Yes.
At least in that part he's consistent. But we did see that the Kesef Mishnah, at least at this point, is holding that the agricultural laws for the Rambam are D-Oraysah. Okay. Now take a look at the Beis Yosef, which was written by whom? The Kesef Mishnah.
Yeah, but he wrote it later, though.
He wrote it later. Admittedly, he wrote it later. So we do have evidence that the Beis Yosef was Choser, and he changed his mind in the Rambam and feels that the Rambam holds that it's really only D-Rabanan. Take a look at the Beis Yosef. He says, Uvashvius He Shemitah, va'aser bacharisha uvazriya, uvachol avodas karka be'eretz Yisrael ha'idna D-Rabanan. He says that law, which we say that you're not allowed to plow or plant or do any work on the soil, today is only D-Rabanan. And he goes through the Gemara in Gittin, and he quotes the Yerushalmi as well, and then V'kach heim divrei harambam behilcho Shemitah perek tes uperek yud that Reb Shmuel just quoted. The kosav smag dahachi kaimalan that we paskin this way that it's only D-Rabanan. V'lo kitanai desabri deshvius noheges afal pisha ein yovel noheg, and not like the Tanoim in the Brisa of Torah's Kohanim of that we just quoted before, that says that it's D-Oraysah. So the Beis Yosef changes his mind from what he wrote in the Kesef Mishnah by the time he writes the Beis Yosef. Okay? Good. Now,
were they both written in the same place?
Yeah.
In the same location? Was he located in the same place?
Well, Rabbi Yosef Karo lived in Sfat at the end of his life, but I don't know if he was in Spain earlier. I'm not sure. I don't know yet. I don't know the full biography.
In other words, did he change his mind when he was in Sfat and saw how difficult it was to...
That's a very good question. I don't know. I don't know whether it was based upon external pressures that made him change his position. It's unclear. Now, the only problem in this whole discussion is that there's a tshuva from the Rambam that was first printed a couple of centuries ago, but it's more recent than the printings of the Rambam that were accessible to the Beis Yosef, to the Kesef Mishnah. This tshuva seems to say explicitly that for the Rambam, the laws of Shemitah agriculturally are D-Oraysah. So this is the tshuva in the Rambam. It's in Shut HaRambam Siman Kuf Chav Ches in the Bar Ilan CD. Different orderings, different numberings, and different svarim. And the Rambam writes, this is in source number 11. Ve'ata k'shehitavnu la'ayin u'ledakdeik b'chol halacha v'halacha b'chiburenu hagadol. He says, when we had the opportunity to delve deeply into every law that we've included in the Mishnah Torah, nispor lanu perizos ha-Mishnah, then it becomes clear that we paskin like Rabbi as far as Shmitas Ksofim, v'hisha avodas Eretz Yisrael b'shvius below sa'aseh, kemo shabir hakasav. And he says that it's very clear that the laws of Shemitah are a mitzvahs lo saseh, and he's speaking bisman hazeh, as the pasuk says, lo sizra'u v'lo siksru es eficheha v'lo sidsru es nizireha. V'chol masha tatzmiach aretz me'ileha me'peras aretz me'peras ha'ilon muter la'ochlo v'hefker. He says, but what does grow on its own from the land, as far as produce, you are allowed to eat, and it is considered to be hefker. That you're allowed to eat all the produce of the field. Later on in a future shir, I want to explain to you the whole basis of the heter mechira, of otzer based in, of how all of these principles work on a practical basis. That's not our shir for tonight, but we'll talk about that later on. Umaimer HaMishnah Shvius nitla la'achilo l'shtia u'lesicha la'lakas aner. As the Mishnah itself says, that the produce of the Shemitah year, you're allowed to eat, you can drink, you can anoint yourself with it, you can use it as fuel. V'zehu din Torah. And that's all D-Oraysah. Aval midivrei sofrim gazru al kol masha tatzmiach haaretz b'shvius mimasha derech b'nei adam lizor am gar'inim. He says, the rabbis, however, banned you from eating on Shemitah those things that grow on their own from seeds. You're only allowed to eat the fruit of Shemitah. You're not allowed to eat things that grow like vegetables that grow from the ground. He says, the rabbis banned you from eating those things. Why? Because if we allow you to eat wild growing tomatoes during Shemitah, we're scared that you'll be tempted to plant seeds on your own during Shemitah, and that's prohibited. So even though the laws of Shemitah D-Oraysah only prohibit you from planting, but you're allowed to eat all the produce of the Shemitah that's wild growing, The rabbis further banned a certain subset of produce that grows from the ground, like grains and legumes and vegetables, because if we allow you to eat them, even though they're perfectly permitted D-Oraysah, you may come and plant beans on your own.
So this now is the D-Rabanan l'chumra.
Yes, the Rabbanan l'chumra on top of the D-Oraysah.
So you'd be planting it the year before Shemitah in order to be able to have them on Shemitah.
To plant them, yes, but even if you planted them before Shemitah, if they grew on their own, or let's say no one planted them, let's say the wind scattered seeds, tomato seeds or beans, they were spilled on the ground.
On their own every year.
Yeah.
There are vegetables.
Vegetables grow on their own. Yeah,
Every year,
yeah.
automatically.
Those you can't eat, midrabanan. Midoraisa, there's nothing wrong with it, midrabanan. Comes along the Rambam and he can, I'm skipping a whole chunk. He says, Shemash shazorim hagoyim be'eretz Yisrael ba'shvius, afilu ba'meshe herziko olei bavel mutter ba'achila. He says, but that's only when it comes to things that grow on their own. He says, but what Gentiles plant in Eretz Yisrael during Shemitah, even in Eretz Yisrael proper, those things you are allowed to eat. Meaning, if a Gentile plants during the Shemitah year, he plants vegetables, then you're allowed to eat those. Lefisha etzem hadavar hatzomeach umashehim zorim mutar ba'achila min haTorah. V'lo gazru alav elo mishum ovrei avera Yisrael shim zara avar gazru alav al svichei artso shema Yizra. But so he says, the only thing that we prohibit you from eating are certain kinds of vegetables, lest you come to plant them on your own. Those are called sfichim. However, hagoy she'enu mitzuva ala shvius sfichei artso mutarin. But if the land is owned by a Gentile, then even the sfichim of his land are permitted. He says, because since that's not within the purview of a Jew, we're not worried that by allowing you to eat them, you're going to plant in your own land. We're only worried that if we allow you to eat sfichim that grow in your land, you'll come to plant your land further. But if they grew in a Gentile's land, even in Eretz Yisrael, then we allow you to eat them. Ve'ein hevdel bein sfichei arzo ve'ein mashu hu zareya hol v'hu mutter lizroa ve'ein shum panim lachshosh le'esor zos b'sibaso. Ma tomar peros hagoy asrum gezerah shema Yisra. What about your fear? Maybe we should aser the vegetables of a goy because you may come to plant. He says, "Hu Yisra below safek ve'ein olav chet." The worst thing is that the goy will plant. So what? V'im nomar gezerah svichei goy atu svichei Yisrael higufa gezerah kamosha bi'arnu nikom v'nigzor gezerah l'gezerah. He says, and to say that, well, if we let you eat the free-growing vegetables of a goy in a goy's land, you'll come to eat free-growing vegetables in your land, that already becomes a gezerah l'gezerah. L'lefi ikari rayon nireh shezeh mutar ve'ein sham isra min haTorah elo lizroa levad. Kemoshin Isbar beGemara Rosh Hashanah. Aval Adavar Hatsamech Afilu Ovar Vizara Harehu Mutter Min HaTorah Kemo Kilei Zraim Asher Asura L'Zuriyasim Mutter Lechal Adavar Hatsameach Ugzer Shema Yisra Asura Afilu Sfichin Ha'olem Me'aleim. You see from the whole language of this tshuva that the Rambam is talking about an Isser D-Oraysah. There is an Isser D-Oraysah today to plant, but not to eat wild growing vegetables. That's only Asr Midrabanan. But from the tshuva itself, from the language of the tshuva, what do you see from the Rambam? He's clearly addressing an Isser D-Oraysah. And he's saying that the reason why sfichim are only Asr Midrabanan is because the Torah only prohibits the act of planting. But if you've planted and you were over on a D-Oraysah, then the produce that results from that planting is not Asr Midrabanan b'diavad. It's only Asr Midrabanan. Good? Are we clear? So the Rambam himself seems to go against the Beis Yosef's understanding of the Rambam. Unfortunately, the Beis Yosef didn't have this tshuva from the Rambam. So he didn't have the ability to check the Rambam's own words. But, as I mentioned, the Rambam himself, I feel, was deliberately vague in Mishnah Torah. Because he understood. He's living in Cairo. He understands the limitations and the burdens on the Jews living in Eretz Yisrael. And he can't perhaps bring himself to actually come out explicitly, at least not in the Mishnah Torah, to say that there's an Isser D-Oraysah of Shemitah, afilu bizman hazeh. Because if that were the case, then there might be a number of things that would be added to the prohibition.
The Rambam is not concerned about who's doing the planting, but rather on whose land it's planted.
The Rambam is concerned, he is concerned about who's doing the planting. He says that regardless of who planted and regardless of whose land it grew upon, b'di'evid the produce is permitted. B'di'evid the produce is permitted. The Torah only prohibits the act of planting. Once you've planted, b'di'evid, even if you planted b'isser, b'di'evid the produce is permitted. He's saying that we will, however, prohibit all produce that's growing in Eretz Yisrael, midrabanan, if it's growing on a Jew's land. If it's growing on a Gentile's land, that's already too far remote of a disconnect from the original isser of planting, and therefore will permit you, even lechatchila, to have a Gentile plant and you can eat his produce. It's a little bit ambiguous in the language.
Is the Rambam pasking Rabbi Meir that the land of a goy is subject to shvius in Eretz Yisrael? In other words, does this have kedusha shvius, or do you say that the land of a goy has nothing to do with shvius?
I don't know. I don't know from the language of the Rambam. It's a good question. I don't know. It's something that we'd have to research. But the point that I wanted to bring from this tshuva is that the Rambam seems to be holding that it's D-Oraysah.
Okay, but the thing is, though, the mechaber of the Shulchan Aruch paskin is the Rabbanan.
Right. So it comes along. We have
Because he's relying on the Rambam.
We have a machlokas who's relying on the Rambam. Now we have this long-standing machlokas in the Rishonim. There are many Rishonim who argue, even with the Beis Yosef's understanding of the Rambam, who hold that it's D-Oraysah. We saw very clearly in Rashi that it's a machlokas in Chazal as to whether agricultural Shemitah is D-Oraysah or Rabbanan. The Sifra that Rashi quotes and that the Kesef Mishnah quoted clearly indicate that Shemitah, agriculturally at least, is D-Oraysah. Now, comes along the Chazon Ish. Very important Chazon Ish that a lot of people cite, and says, V'nira d'le'inyan shvius bizman hazeh. This is in the 3rd chapter of the Chazon Ish's Hilchos Shvius. He says, Yesh lismoch shehu midrabanan. You can rely on the fact that it's rabbinic. Shezehu das harambam. K'moshe pasak Rabbi v'chei mashma b'lashon harambam perek yod halacha tes. And uve Kesef Mishnah nidchak sham. And he says that the Kesef Mishnah was a little bit of a doichak over there, because the Kesef Mishnah concluded that the Rambam was D-Oraysah. But he says, I don't agree with the Kesef Mishnah over there, who says that the Rambam would still hold that agriculturally it's D-Oraysah. Okay, v'hata kasav v'perek dalet halacha chafei denoik shelo b'fnei habayis ein raya the hakasav came gam b'truma. He says the fact that the Rambam writes that Shemitah is extant even in the absence of a temple doesn't mean that it's extant mid-D-Oraysah. He means that it's extant, period. But it's only extant mid-Rabanan. Because the Rambam uses that same language when he talks about the laws of Truma, which clearly only apply to Rabbanan after the existence of a temple. And he says, V'zunira das harayvid, perek yud halacha vav, shekasav sheminyan zman hazeh hu zikaron shviyah shel Torah. And the Ravid seems to say that it's also midrabanan, and he goes on. But then he says that the Ravid seems to be Soser himself, and he says therefore that we have a big machlokus in the Rishonim as to whether it's midrabanan or midrabanan. But the Chazon Ish says that we do have a right, based upon our reliance on the Rambam, to posit that Shemitah Bisman Hazeh is only midrabanan. And therefore, what will ensue are a series of kulas that you could employ. If, according to the Rambam, it's only an Isser d'Rabanan, so then it's like we explained in the Ravid. Since it's only an Isser d'Rabanan, the reason why you're allowed to plant is because of Hefsid Meruba. Because you can lose the farm if you don't provide for the army. They're going to confiscate your farm. And therefore, what you see is that this reading of the Rambam that the Chazon Ish and others present indicates to me that since agricultural Shemitah is only midrabanan bisman hazeh, when there are extenuating circumstances of abject poverty, that we could lose everything, we could lose possession of Eretz Yisrael, we'll certainly lose control of the country, we'll starve, and all of these other horrible calamities, then we have certain heterim that we can employ to allow us to plant. So maybe we can sell the land to non-Jews. Maybe we can hire non-Jews to work the land for us. Maybe we can plant under limited circumstances, all because the laws of Shemitah are only midrabanan bisman hazeh. So do you understand that this has very, very practical ramifications? The way that the Chazon Ish is understanding the Rambam is that the reason why it's okay to plant during Shemitah for the army is not because your life is in danger, but rather because you're under abject financial duress. Fine. Let's look at the Satmar Rebbe of blessed memory. The Satmar Rebbe says, I object. And of course, you know that his worldview was stay away from Eretz Yisrael.
He objects all of Israel.
Stay away from Eretz Yisrael until Mashiach Tzeit. So part of this, he's got two tshuvas on Shemitah Bisman Hazeh that go on for pages and pages and pages. And the true brilliance of the Satmar Rebbe shines when you read the Bekiyas that he had in so many different areas of halacha and all different kinds of svarim. But he writes, his objection is basically this. He says, Masha asafis haposkim hasovrim shvius bizman hazeh D-Rabanan uliditu mutter mishum arnonia af kishe'ein sakana ela hefsid mammon bilvad. He says, my challenger, because I had written that Shemitah Bisman Hazeh is D-Oraysah, and you, my challenger, have written that it's only D-Rabanan, based on the Gemara, and the poskim who understand the Gemara, like the Chazon Ish understands the Rambam, that the reason why you're allowed to plant during Shemitah is because of this great financial duress that you're under, not because of sakana. Hine hevi haposkim hasovrim shu D-Rabanan, v'lo hevi haposkim hasovrim shu D-Oraysah. Okay, fine. I'm not denying the fact that there are poskim who hold that Shemitah Bisman Hazeh is D-Rabanan, but you can't just ignore a whole other litany of poskim who say that it's D-Oraysah. And the Sefer Charedim writes that most poskim hold that Shemitah Bisman Hazeh is D-Oraysah. V'ayin tumim simin samach zayin chvar hevesi divrei hashayges aryeh v'hapri chadash shebora beinehem kaosan hashita shesofrim shehu mid-D-Oraysah v'chein kasav achsam sofer. He quotes the Shagas Aryeh, the Pri Chadash, the Chasam Sofer. All of these poskim, he say, hold that it's D-Oraysah. V'harbe poskim ein sfuros lamo. He says, and there's an unlimited number, virtually, of poskim who hold this way. Uvelimit hayeshiva bi'arti ba'arucha sherov harishonim sovrim shvius bisman hazeh D-Oraysah. And this is the way I've taught shir in the yeshiva, that most poskim hold that it's D-Oraysah. Ubi'arti gam divrei hakesef mishnah hanirim kesosrim l'chora. He says, I've also explained how we can be miyashev the words of the Kesef Mishnah to make them work out that they're not soser each other. V'lo eis laharich bazeh. And he says, but now's not a time to expand on this, even though he expands unbelievably. This is like the 12th sif of a 20 sif tshuva. He said that goes on for pages. He says, you know why I don't want to, we don't need to expand on this? He says, Ki harbe poskim gedolim va'atsumim barishonim v'gdolei ha'achronim bein mitzad hasovrim shu D-Oraysah uvein mitzad hasovrim shu D-Rabanan. He says, because we're going to find support on both sides. Ve'ein be'erchenu lahachriya bazeh. And you're not going to be able to find one way to tip the scales one way or the other. However, al kolpanim zev vadai shemidei sveika lo nafka. He says, but one thing is clear, that we have this doubt. Is Shemitah Bisman Hazeh agriculturally D-Oraysah or D-Rabanan? He says, V'hu safek atzum shel pluk to D-Rabvasa. It's based on the fact that we've got these mountains on either side telling us one way or the other. Umavur b'taz yoredeya simin shin mem beis katan aleph b'shem haran. B'chol mili de mesafkalani havi min haTorah miD'Rabanan mikri sveika D-Oraysah l'chumra. That he quotes a very important yesod from the Taz. The Taz says that whenever you have a suffix, whether a law is mid-D-Oraysah or mid-Rabanan, we apply the principle of suffix mid-D-Oraysah l'chumra, and we therefore say that because we're misupak, whether this is a biblical law or a rabbinic law, we have to be machmir and treat it like a biblical law. So he says, the imkain e efshir lahakel v'lismoch al haposkim sheshvius bisman hazeh D-Rabanan keven shu al kol panim sveika D-Oraysah u'lechumra. And on that, we'll let you ruminate over what we've learned tonight. But let me just add one more facet. There are some poskim, and I haven't researched this fully. I only have this mipi hashmua, but I know that it's written somewhere, who are of the opinion that when the majority of the Jewish people live in Eretz Yisrael, then even those poskim who say that Shemitah Bisman Hazeh is D-Rabanan will hold that Shemitah Bisman Hazeh is D-Oraysah. So we're within the next 20 years we're going to be there. Now there will still be those who could still argue that Shemitah is D-Rabanan until all Shnei Esrei Shvatim are present in Eretz Yisrael.
Except that you have that Yirmiyahu brought back representatives of the Seretz of Shvatim. The Gemara, they kept Yovel for the last 36 years.
Yes, but it's still a machlokas, Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Shmuel, whether the Aseret HaShvatim will ever come back.
You know, but he said, but you know Yirmiyahu at the twilight years of the Churban.
Of the Churban, yes.
Brought back representatives and they kept Shemitah and Yovel.
And they kept Shemitah and Yovel during those last few years.
36 years, yeah.
But the question is, you could argue that Shemitah will never be D-Rabanan, D-Oraysah, because according to either Rabbi Shmuel or Rabbi Akiva, the Aseret HaShvatim will never come back. So I don't know what to do with that. But anyway,
what were they doing the last 36 years of the bias Rishon then? The Gemara said they kept Shemitah and Yovel, D-Oraysah.
So you learned because Yirmiyah brought all of them back.
Brought back some of them.
No, you can say so. They'll hold that he brought back enough to be considered to be a rove.
Okay, and that's
You also have to hold they went back to their nachla.
They went back to their nachla as well.
Hard to say.
Right. Okay. All right. Something to think about. Have a good evening.